There is no horror that cannot occur in a human society once economic order collapses.
Hey friends, thanks for joining us. We have back on the line our good friend and longtime friend, Jeff Nielson from Bullion Bulls, Canada. Jeff, welcome back.
Hi, Sean. Nice to be back again.
Hey, it's good to hear your voice, Jeff, and good to see you. How have you been?
Well, keeping busy. Still doing my writing at Bullion Bulls, Canada, and also have my publishing arrangement with Sprott Money, and that's working out wonderfully. I'm getting some extra exposure there. And, just looking into other avenues in terms of my own career development.
Well, you know what? I've got good news for you, Jeff. People like having you out there and certainly appreciate your commentary. You just wrote a piece that we posted the other day. I'm going to read it for folks here in a second. We'll talk about it and some nice comments as a result of posting that article. But I wanted to start here with you. I just interviewed Bill Holter, and Bill provided some excellent analysis of where we are as we document the collapse. And let me just frame this up for you, Jeff, because I'd love to have your opinion. He wrote a recent article called Triggers, and you and he actually, and Andy Hoffman, all talk about many of the same things, but in this article, Triggers, he talks about the pieces of the anti-dollar puzzle which are now rapidly falling into place, one of which is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That's one of the pieces of the de-dollarization puzzle, and another is the new clearing system set to directly compete with SWIFT, while yet another puzzle piece is the BRICS Bank, and the final piece of the puzzle is the Shanghai Physical Metals Exchange, potentially bankrupting the COMEX and the LBMA. Aside from the article that you wrote recently that we're going to cover, where would you like to begin, and what is your analysis of where we are in the collapse?
Well, trying to pin me down to a starting point here is pretty tough because, like you say, there is so much going on and it's happening very fast now. We were seeing a slow movement away from Western institutions to Eastern institutions, new Eastern institutions being constructed to at least compete with the West, if not replace those corrupted institutions. And of course, that movement was relentless. But now it's simply accelerating at an almost hard to believe pace as we see formerly staunch allies of the U.S. defect to this AAIB and do so with not the slightest degree of timidity.
Yeah, doing so with reckless abandon. I had remarked to Bill in the interview that it seems like the entire world is actively preparing for the end of the dollar. And he said that he believes that the world has, for the last at least 2 years, been preparing themselves to move away from the dollar, but also they've been isolating the United States, isolating the West, because they know a collapse is coming, and they want to isolate themselves from the Western financial system. This is the system, this Western financial system is the system that our friends, neighbors, and colleagues all eagerly embrace and love and just swear to themselves will never, ever collapse. They think the dollar is going to be here forever, Jeff.
Well, and of course, you talk about isolating the West, but in causal terms, it's really kind of the opposite. It's the West that has isolated itself by behaving like a bunch of rogue regimes. No respect for the rule of law, bullying and terrorizing other nations, stealing property, destroying economies. Their crimes have gotten to such a level of comic book villainy that they have literally forced the rest of the world to join together for their own common protection. So it's not so much, at least from my point of view, the world seeking to isolate the West as the West forcing this isolation upon itself.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think the world is getting very, very tired of funding this aggression, of funding these unconstitutional Zbigniew Brzezinski grand chessboard wars without end. Now we're eagerly bombing Yemen and joining Saudi Arabia in another unconstitutional front. It's very, very frustrating, and I think from a libertarian or at least a human standpoint, those of us who believe in peace and love and believe there's plenty of resources on planet Earth for everyone, it's good to see the rest of the world standing up to the United States in this way, if it's only economically.
Well, but I think it has to be this way because, as I've been stressing in my own writing to a greater and greater extent, what we have to be aware of is the mentality of these fascists who control our economies and our governments. They are literally psychopaths. And of course, when you deal with people that are this predatory and malevolent, you don't want to confront them in any open military manner because, they're capable of anything. These are people that have talked about winning strategic nuclear wars, having tactical nuclear wars. So you don't want to, engage those people in direct confrontation unless you're willing to play Russian roulette with literally the end of the world.
Well, that's not hyperbole because we saw just a couple of weeks ago the ICBM Minuteman missile test that the United States bragged about and that the military openly, publicly, in a PR sort of way said the test was to illustrate for the world how we can strike anywhere at any time, essentially threatening the rest of the world with our nukes. And that is very, very scary, and it is very, very malevolent. That was a great word you used. It is a malevolent system at this point, isn't it?
Well, and it also, that point you just made illustrates how the West has isolated itself. Of course, this missile test from the U.S. and its Star Wars system are direct violations of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which the U.S. entered into with the Soviet Union to supposedly prevent such weapons proliferation. But the fact is the U.S. refuses to abide by treaties. It does whatever it wants. It signs deals and expects other parties to live up to their terms and punishes them if they don't. But, as far as its own actions go, it's just words on paper. It means nothing to these fascists.
Well, these fascists are malevolent, and we see them coming after us now with the police state. We see the military exercises like Jade Helm that will be rolling out in mid-July and running through mid-August. We see just so many aspects of this police state apparatus rolling out here in the United States. And against the backdrop of all of that overt, essentially, violence, or at least psychological violence against the American people, we see the multi-quadrillion dollar interest rate, the 0% interest rate scam, which you wrote about recently, and that is the tyranny of the banksters. You write, what has not been previously articulated to readers are the implications of having a single banking monopoly. You often note is the one bank, I think the Rothschild Bank, which is the recipient of all our government's 0% interest and near zero interest lending. Indeed, it is the ultra-extreme example of a single financial behemoth receiving unimaginably large sums of these sham, quote, loans, which best illustrates the inherent fraud of such transactions. And you go on to conclude, Jeff, that they're fraudulent because they're 0% interest loans, which essentially are gifts. Who's going to pay back a 0% interest loan with no repayment schedule? It's a gift.
Well, and the point here is that it was only relatively a few years ago where it was commonly recognized in our legal system that a so-called 0% loan was a sham transaction. And if our courts ever came across such supposed transactions, they would rule them null and void because they were obviously connected to some form of fraud. Generally, tax evasion is one of the ways you have these sorts of devices. But there's no possible legitimate purpose for a 0% loan. It is prima facie fraud, and it's always been recognized as such. And of course, now we live in an era where these governments treat it as being perfectly normal. Fraud is perfectly normal. I mean, what could be a better commentary on the disdain these fascists have for the rule of law?
Yeah, and just to be clear, we should flush this out. You're not making the argument for usury, are you, Jeff?
Well, I actually raised that argument in a separate post, a separate commentary rather, which I wrote for Sprott Money. And the point I made there is if you compare the interest rate of someone, the bankers getting their 0% loans, and you compare the interest rate paid by one of the little people when they lend that free money to us, the difference in quantum using multiplication as our means of separating them is infinity. 0% and even 1% interest, the difference between that in terms of multiplication is infinity. The 1% interest rate is infinitely higher than 0%. And of course, people will say, well, gee, that's an example which distorts the principle. Well, no, it doesn't. It illustrates it precisely because what we're dealing with is entirely different treatment in kind. One special privileged class gets free money. Everybody else has to pay for their money. or of course even earn it, something which is absolutely unheard of to the bankers. Earning money, what could be more barbaric? But this is the whole point here. In terms of just the principle of fairness, even if it wasn't the argument of fraud, on the principle of fairness, we cannot possibly justify having one privileged class getting 0% loans, i.e. gifts, while everybody else has to pay for the same thing. Making us pay for what they get for free is the definition of usury. It is infinitely more interest that we're paying for the same thing they get for free. So, of course, they either everybody has to get their money for free, or nobody can get it for free. That is the only possible way to have a legitimate system. And we've already established that if everybody gets it for free, that's just fraud.
Yeah, and the reason I wanted to touch on usury is because the banks loan out this money, this 0% money, at usurious interest rates. It is not uncommon for people to go and want to buy a new refrigerator at an appliance store, to apply for credit to purchase the refrigerator through a GE Capital or some other large national banking institution, where they're getting the refrigerator loan at 29.9% interest. And that is a perfect example of usury. The banks get the money at 0% from the central bank, the good old boys system. The rich get richer at 0% money, loaned out of existence, created out of existence by the American people, by the U.S. Treasury, by the Federal Reserve, and given to the banks at 0%, and the banks can turn around and put the chains of enslavement on the people through this fraudulent credit system. It's absolutely disgusting, isn't it?
Well, but the bigger point here is that they do the same thing with nations. We have the United States paying essentially 0% interest on its unimaginably huge debts. It's hopelessly insolvent by any possible objective definition. And, a few years ago, I wrote a commentary comparing the economies of the US to the economies of Greece, and noting that they were both extremely insolvent, and they were both extremely insolvent in similar manners. Specifically, that both had grossly overinvested in military spending and military infrastructure that was beyond the capacity of their economy to sustain. And so, we have the US being grossly overextended financially and paying practically 0% interest on its own debts. Then we have the one bank manipulating global interest rate markets on Greek debts to force interest rates up to as high as 30% on the Greek economy. And of course, that bankrupted that economy, just like the US economy would be bankrupted in a matter of weeks if it was forced to pay 30% interest on its near $20 trillion in official debt. That's the same thing that they do to destroy people on an individual basis at the micro level. The one bank is literally able to do at the level of nations, destroying national economies.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's well stated because in my example, a smaller national bank like GE Capital is enslaving a family to 30% usurious interest rates on a refrigerator, and on the macroeconomic international level, you have big monstrous Goliath international banking institutions like Goldman Sachs enslaving entire nation states to debt, as is the case with Greece. The IMF doing much the same. And again, what a great way to bridge back to the AIIB, which the United States wants nothing to do with and hopes that the other nation states want nothing to do with it. And the AIIB is going to be a counterbalance to the tyranny of the IMF and the World Bank. And it seems to me, Jeff, that the AIIB is actually interested in making loans to nations so they can build infrastructure, whereas the IMF is hell-bent on stealing infrastructure through loans which will never be repaid.
Well, ultimately, what the World Bank and the IMF have been over the past quarter century is nothing more than glorified loan sharks. They look for nations that are in financial trouble, and they offer to help them. And of course, the bailouts they give them are just loans, piling more debt onto nations that are already bankrupt. And I mean, this is the insanity of what's going on currently with Greece. I wrote a commentary entitled "Greece Says No to Fake Bailouts," because, of course, what's being done in Europe over the past 6 years is just piling more loans onto bankrupt economies. How do you bail somebody out by digging them even deeper into debt? I mean, it's nonsensical. And yet we have, Greece's government Greece's new honest government attempting to be rational about this and saying, look, we need to find a way to make the system actually work. And the only way to do that is to reduce debt levels so that they become sustainable, not increase them. You don't bail out debtors by piling more debt on top of them. And of course, the insanity that we get from the corporate media is that it's Greece that's being radical, and Greece that's being unreasonable for simply seeking to move toward a sustainable path for future development. I mean, if that's radical, I don't know what the meaning of the word is.
That's an excellent segue to another topic I want to discuss with you, and that's Rand Paul being labeled as extreme. We'll circle back to that in a second, but again, the mainstream media making every attempt to remove discourse and remove reality from anything within the public square. They don't want this system threatened by anyone at any point. But I want to bridge back to your article here, the multi-quadrillion dollar 0% interest scam. I just want to let you know that Rob wrote, great article. It is counterfeiting, plain and simple. By law, the perpetrators and those complicit in the carrying out of this agenda to destroy this country and rip off the entire planet. He goes on to say, thanks, Jeff, for all you do. Another one from Eric. I thought Jeff was dropping out. Glad he hasn't. This is the time to push and push hard against the criminal bankers. The problem, Jeff, is that there is just no rule of law. There is no recourse in this country, and I suspect it's the same thing in Canada.
Well, it was interesting listening to those comments to hear the use of the word counterfeit. That was a word that I first trotted out about 3 years ago in trying to explain the massive fraud that we know as the U.S. Treasuries market, and pointing out how there was simply no money to prop up this market, no legitimate money, to keep this fraudulent market floating at all-time record high prices. And of course, the only way that you can prop up a bubble without any visible means of support is some means of secret cash. And of course, the easiest way to do that if you're a crime syndicate is to counterfeit it. So, this is the whole point here. We have this, and of course, with the commentary you're referring to, this most recent one, we have this crime syndicate being bestowed indirectly infinite amounts of capital, through this insanity of fractional reserve banking. They can take the original handouts they get for free and multiply it by thousands of times, tens of thousands of times, by simply lending the money back and forth between their various entities at 0%. And so this is the whole point here is even if we were to say that the mechanisms for creating this funny money were technically legal because the law has been stretched to such extremes, all the law basically does is legitimize counterfeiting, because you cannot possibly pretend that any of this newly invented funny money is legitimate.
Right. Well, you know what? Let's circle back, though, too, before I forget, to that extreme comment made about Rand Paul. I loved Ron Paul. I certainly have a great admiration for Ron Paul. And I just don't feel that Rand Paul measures up in a lot of ways. Having said that, Rand Paul is the best of the worst, certainly, I think, out of the Republican candidates. And I was at the club the other day. I was watching the O'Reilly Factor, which is just a despicable show on Fox News. I can't stand that guy any more than I can stand anyone from CNN. But, at the very introduction of the show, they were playing clips of Rand Paul talking about the government budget and how indebted this nation is. And he was laying out facts that, the U.S. budget in 1 minute is $7.2 million or whatever it is. It's this endless black hole of money, this debt that shall never be repaid. And while they were playing these sound bites from him, they were flashing in the word extreme, with then a voiceover saying, is Rand Paul too extreme for the mainstream Republican GOP platform? And again, it's just this endless, vicious bankster propaganda. There's just, I don't know, Jeff, how people can't wake up. Even if you are a Republican and you love Bill O'Reilly, how can you not recognize that type of media presentation as anything less than propaganda? Because it so clearly is.
But the problem, of course, is that they're preaching to zombies. They're preaching to a population that have switched off their minds and just passively receive. And of course, it's so easy to lie to people in that state of mind. And under these circumstances, almost any sorts of falsehoods can be simply passed off, and it won't even arouse a quibble of dissent amongst the zombie population. And so, that's why it's so easy for them to do it, because, there's only a small percentage of us that actually process information when we receive it and can recognize perversity or incongruities in the propaganda as it's being fed to us, whereas the vast majority simply have no mental capacity to detect this propaganda.
Well, the sheeple don't. Here was another one of their talking points, which people will get a kick out of. They were talking about Rand Paul's problem for having previously talked about needing to make cuts at the Pentagon. They were talking about how that, quote unquote, worked for him when the people were war weary, end quote. But now, since the new ISIS attacks and the resurgence of ISIS, the talking points were Americans are very much in favor of more security and no cuts at the Pentagon. These are absolute military-industrial complex talking points. The CIA couldn't craft voiceover any better than the stuff I was listening to. And it really, truly is disgusting because, again, Jeff, if anybody wants to research the truth, they might quickly come to the conclusion that the U.S. government spends, more than 50 cents of every tax dollar on the military, on the Pentagon? And I think that figure is easily more than double of what even China, the second highest expenditure nation, spends on their military. It's out of control. It's a black hole that will never be filled, and the world knows it. So the question now, Jeff, is when does the dollar die? Because this thing is not going to last another 50 years. It may not last another 50 days. Because this system cannot go on forever, especially when all the nation states know we can't pay the debt back.
Well, in fundamental terms, I've been quite clear in the past that the dollar is already worthless, clearly worthless, and it's been that way for at least the last 10 years or so. However, when we think of hyperinflation, which is the economic event where a paper currency loses all of its value, those are always referred to not as economic events, but as confidence events. And of course, this is just the same as with any other con. The con ends when the confidence of the chumps evaporates and they see through the scam. And of course, all paper currencies are a scam. So, this is the real issue here is fundamentally the dollar should go to zero today, but it still has the confidence of the masses for the moment. And of course, this is part of the reason that it's being pumped up so furiously to try to boost the confidence, because the banksters themselves realize that the end of the game is near. But the other side of the coin is we look at the East, who wants to move away from the dollar system and onto a legitimate monetary system based upon China's renminbi, and they don't want to see the dollar collapse prematurely. Because if it collapses prematurely, then the movement from Western monetary system to Eastern monetary system becomes a stampede. And not only does that cause tremendous damage to the West, it causes tremendous damage to the East as well, because a disorderly stampede into China's currency would cause a massive and uncontrollable rise in value, and that would create massive economic disruptions for this population, which amounts to 20% of the total, global population. So, this is the whole point here is China knows that the dollar is already worthless, but it's in China's own interest to make sure that the dollar does not collapse in an uncontrolled fashion before the transfer from West to East is completed. So probably the short way to answer that question is, when will the dollar go to zero? It'll be the day after the renminbi is firmly established as the world reserve currency.
Yeah, and Holter and I were talking about the collapse of the euro and the eurozone, and I asked him which would come first, the collapse of the dollar or the collapse of the euro, and he said, either way, whichever happens first, the next day the other one goes, because everything is so interconnected. And if I could, Jeff, I just want to circle back and quantify what Rand Paul was talking about, for which he was labeled by Fox News and the criminal Bill O'Reilly as extreme. The U.S. budget in 1 hour is $435,841,000. In 1 day, I can't even read these numbers. $10,460,000,000. In 1 week, $73 billion is spent, money they don't have. And the U.S. budget in 1 month, $318,166,000,000. And Jeff, in fiscal year 2011, the U.S. budget was $3.81 trillion, more money than can ever be counted, and a lot more money than can probably ever be paid back. And for bringing that subject up, Rand Paul was labeled extreme.
And, again, we're seeing it's just a duplicate of what I was talking before about with Greece's honest and legitimate government. It wants to move towards sanity and sustainability, and it's called radical. Rand Paul wants to move towards sanity and sustainability with the U.S. economy, and he's called extreme. These people are just totally unprincipled liars. They know that the labels and the name calling they hurl is absolutely baseless. But of course, with the one bank controlling all media outlets in the corporate media, they can say anything they want to their captive population of zombies, and the zombies simply nod in assent.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And we've documented many times how Brian Williams, a CFR member, he got fired essentially for being an overt liar about his own personal role in something that happened during his Iraq war coverage, making stuff up out of whole cloth. You got Erin Burnett over at CNBC. She's a CFR member. So many of the people in the Mockingbird mainstream media, the most important roles are filled by those that are happy to take marching orders from the Council on Foreign Relations. And as a result of doing it, Jeff, they get compensated $2, $3, $4, $7, $8 million, $10 million a year.
Well, and what is so absurd about the Brian Williams episode is, we have all of these shameless drones in the media telling enormous lies about the news itself. And of course, that's what should really count. I mean, these people are just talking heads. If they lie about their own background, so what? They're just a mouth spouting words. They just read copy off of a script. Who cares who's reading the news? What matters is the content of the news. And these shameless liars in the corporate media spout this drivel, which they know is false, day after day after day. And of course, that is never, ever acknowledged. But yeah, we have, when Brian Williams is caught falsifying his own background, then they turn him into a scapegoat to pretend that they're being scrupulously vigilant about maintaining integrity in the media. And I mean, what could be more perverse?
Yeah, and look, the reason I wanted to bring all of that up and the reason we wanted to flush this out about the liars in the Mockingbird mainstream media, Jeff, is because the alternative to that is resources like Bullion Bulls Canada and SGT Report and Zero Hedge and Silver Doctors and Brother John F. and all the other great sites out there, Victory Report, Silverfish VT. There's so many people out there doing honest work, people trying to share truth, people who are eager. The Daily Sheeple, our friend Mac over at shtfplan.com, the antidote to corporate propaganda. And I want to leave people with this. I want to
Let me just interrupt for a second, Sean, because
Sure.
you missed one aspect to that, and it's another source of news which people in the West are turning to with greater frequency: Russian news.
Yeah, RT.
First, it's Russian television, and of course, lately, and to me, it's the ultimate irony. I often see when I go to visit Jim Sinclair's site, Sinclair citing stories from TASS, Russia's official news agency, which used to be universally recognized itself as nothing but a propaganda mouthpiece. And of course, here we have an individual like Jim Sinclair, a very conservative right-wing individual, taking his news from TASS, the wire service of a former communist regime. And to me, that's just the ultimate irony and an ultimate indication of how far the pendulum has swung.
Yeah, one of the writers who I like a lot, Naomi Wolf, and she has often said, if you want to see what's going on inside this country, you need to go outside the country. And I think that really hits the nail on the head with even Press TV, RT. There's so many other news sources in the world. CNN at this point is nothing more than a joke. Unfortunately, the gray-haired people on Social Security love CNN, and I think that is their demographic. But it won't be much longer, and they'll have no viewership left. They're already at 20-year lows. And I just wanted to finally put a period on this conversation, and we're going to wrap it up with this quote from Bill Holter, because the reason for having the conversation about the death of the dollar is that the financial system is clearly collapsing. And the question is, how bad will it get for those of us trapped in the United States, trapped holding only dollars? And Holter says, my hope is that it doesn't get this bad, but my suspicion is that it will get worse, where you have no access to ATMs, credit is completely shut off.
We may have power, water, electricity supply problems. What I'm going to tell you is, if you know how to or can learn how to live like Davy Crockett or Daniel Boone, we may go through a period of time where that's the case. I hope I'm wrong. I fear that I'm right.
Jeff, what's your take on how bad it could get?
Well, this is the whole point. People like ourselves, we talk about what we see happening, and we talk about it with certainty because we know it's coming. But even though we have that degree of clarity, even ourselves, we cannot truly understand how bad things are going to get because we have no experience to compare it to in our entire lifetimes. We haven't lived in some of the horrific regimes which have gone through these sort of terrible economic upheavals and almost always political upheavals as well. You cannot have a dramatic economic collapse without dramatic political turmoil as well. Very possibly riots in the streets. And of course, we know that the US government has not been building all of those detention centers that can house millions and millions of people just to leave them empty forever. So, and this is the whole point. We try to warn people about something which we cannot even truly comprehend ourselves. And so, I would never want to dismiss anybody else's prognosis as being overly alarmist or hyperbolic, because the fact is, nothing can be seen as being beyond the realm of possibility. There is no horror that cannot occur in a human society once economic order collapses. And this is the whole point here. This is why we stress to people over and over again, gold and silver. Alone out of all the peoples of Europe, the German people retain a strong appreciation for silver. And the reason for this is alone amongst Western populations, there are still some people alive in Germany that remember a hyperinflation in their own culture. And the people that had silver when Germany suffered its hyperinflation survived that horrific episode much better than those who had no silver, the people's money. So this is the whole point. There's no more time to say, well, I'm going to protect myself later, or maybe things aren't going to get this bad. You have to prepare for the worst, assume the worst, and prepare today.
Yeah, it's true. And for anyone who does not want to heed the warning, just take a look at a pile of $20 trillion. And we really do appreciate your commentary and your perspective. Our guest has been Jeff Nielson from BullionBullsCanada.com, a longtime friend of SGT Report and an all-around good guy. Jeff, thanks so much.
Always a pleasure, Sean.
And guys, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for liking and sharing this information with others, friends, family, colleagues. We really do appreciate your support. And have a great weekend. Bye-bye. Bye, Jeff.
See you later, Sean.